Hello, I'm Mary Husong Callan, President of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metropolitan area. The League is pleased to co-sponsor this important debate between the candidates for the 25th Congressional District in the Democratic primary election. The League is nonpartisan, which means we do not endorse political parties or candidates. The League believes that informed voters are the backbone of our democracy. We register citizens to vote and encourage them to cast informed ballots in every election. We study issues of public interest and share our findings publicly. We advocate for policy change. We also sponsor public forums such as this debate. We are grateful to WROC TV News 8 for presenting this program. For information on candidates and to find your polling place, we invite you to visit our electronic voter guide at www.lwv-rma.org. And please remember to vote in the primary election on Tuesday, June 26th, and the general election on Tuesday, November 6th. Thank you.
Live from the News 8 studio, this is a special presentation from your local election headquarters. The 25th Congressional District Democratic Primary Debate, moderated by News 8's Adam Chodak and presented by the Rochester League of Women Voters.
And good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us for the 25th Congressional District Democratic Primary Debate. News 8 is once again partnering with the League of Women Voters to give all voters a chance to hear from the candidates hoping to succeed Louise Slaughter, who had held the seat for 3 decades. The primary is on June 26th. The candidates are Brighton Town Board Member Robin Wilt, Rachel Barnhart, Rochester City Council Member Adam McFadden, and Assemblyman Joe Morelli. We want to welcome our in-studio audience. We've asked them to hold their applause throughout the debate, except for now, as we welcome the candidates. The rules are simple. Each candidate will have 1.5 minutes to answer the question directed to them. Then all the other candidates will have 1 minute to respond. I may at times give a candidate 30 seconds to address remarks that mention them. The candidates drew numbers for order, and we begin with Robin Wilt. Ms. Wilt, on your website, you say that no person is illegal. But the fact is, over the years, millions of people have entered our country illegally and undetected. In the House, you might be asked to compromise and heighten border security, perhaps even build a wall, or at least fund a wall. Would you be open to something like that?
Adam, thank you so much for that question. This question is very personal to me because I am the daughter of immigrants to this country. And no person is illegal. As a matter of fact, people may enter this country undocumented, but they are not illegal. No human being is illegal, and I think that's what we need in our immigration policy. We need humanity. And on the Brighton Town Board, we just passed a proclamation by Amnesty International that basically welcomed refugees to our shore. And that's, I think, what we should strive for. This current situation where we have people entering the country in coming from the most horrible of circumstances and then being subjected to traumatizing situations here is simply untenable and unfair and inhumane.
Ms. Barnhart.
There's no question that Donald Trump is hostile to immigrants. He has shut the door on refugees. He is denying asylum to domestic abuse victims, and he is separating families at the border, even taking babies away from their parents. This is not consistent with American values. There is no question that we need comprehensive immigration reform. We have got to resolve the status of the more than 11 million undocumented immigrants in our country. We also have to provide more oversight to ICE, which absolutely has been engaged in human rights abuses. Donald Trump wants mass deportations, but that would destabilize families and communities and businesses. We have got to come up with solutions that have compassion and common sense.
Thank you, Mr. McFadden.
It's interesting that we use the word illegal when many of my ancestors were brought here illegally, stolen in the slave trade from their homelands. And now this country wants to call people illegal if they come here looking for a better time, better job, better access to some of the things that this country calls America's promise. I would not support a border wall. As a matter of fact, Congress right now is considering a compromise bill that they're trying to get Donald Trump to sign, which would add $26 billion to the budget to build that wall and to expand the Border Patrol from 19,000 Border Patrol officers to 26. I'm not even sure that we need those. We also need to stop entering on buses 100 miles within our borders, scraping people off the bus, taking them, separating them from their families, and losing children at that. We need to investigate what happened to the thousands of kids that were taken from their families and now are lost in the system. Can you imagine what that could do to a family? That's real terrorism, separating a mother and its child.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli.
Thanks, Adam, for the question. And let me thank League of Women Voters and WRLC for hosting this important discussion. I think this is the most important midterm election in this country's history. And this issue is one of the most important reasons why. You have a president of the United States who is dividing Americans. The entire promise of America is that people come from other places. We are all, in a sense, immigrants. And the notion that you would divide families, as the president has talked about today, the notion that you would try to export people who have lived here their whole lives and send them to places where they may not speak the language and they may have come as children. So this is vitally important, which is why in the state legislature I voted to enact the DREAM Act. I voted for DACA to make it permanent in the state of New York. Path to citizenship is necessary, and in Congress I'll work to make sure that happens, that we don't separate families and we allow people to become American citizens and fulfill the American dream.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli. Ms. Barnhart, this question is for you. You have expressed respect and admiration for Congresswoman Slaughter. I'm interested to know if there was any issue or legislative initiative that you differed with her on or perhaps would have handled differently.
There's no question that Congresswoman Slaughter was a cause congresswoman, from genetic discrimination to the Stock Act to her advocacy for high-speed rail. I will pick up the ball on her issues that were dear to her, but I will say on the issue of high-speed rail, I want to expand that because I have long been a proponent of public transit. We simply do not fund public transportation properly in our country and in Rochester. Our local bus authority has gotten inconsistent amounts of federal funding. I think this year they got less funding. Public transit is an environmental and social justice issue. We know that cars pollute. We've got to get people out of their cars and onto buses, but we need a system that works for people. We also know that jobs have migrated to the suburbs and people can't get to them, and they're forced into subprime predatory auto loans. This is a huge issue that we have to solve for our community, and it's one that I am extremely dedicated to.
Mr. McFadden?
I would say this. Congresswoman Slaughter served this community for a number of years, honorably and with a lot of respect. And I can't think of too many issues that I would disagree with her on. But I will say this about photonics. She was, I guess, a major part of bringing that to our area. And we have not told the truth about what photonics really is. Photonics was not about job creation for our area. It was about the Department of Defense wanting to make sure that the Americans controlled whatever technology came out of it. I really, truly believe that we need to put money into STEM education to prepare our population for those types of jobs and employment opportunities. There has not been any money delivered to this area to provide that type of opportunity for our citizens. Most of the people who are getting the jobs in photonics are coming from outside of our region. We need to build our own infrastructure and build up our own people.
Mr. Morelli?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. This is, in many ways, a very personal question for me because Louise Slaughter and I were friends for 38 years. I remember as a young man going to her office, talking about a career in government, and her encouraging me to run for the county legislature. And our friendship grew over the years. We were not only professionally linked and worked on bringing photonics and all the work that's being done in that cluster here. The state and federal government partnered on that. We partnered on the train station. We partnered on things like the redevelopment of the inner loop. But she was really much more than that to me. She was a friend and a mentor. Her imprint, not only on this community, but on this country, is something that no person will be able to do. She leaves an enormous legacy, and I would like to fulfill that because I think she and I shared the same values, certainly worked on the same issues, but it was those values that matter the most to me.
Ms. Wilt?
I have the utmost respect for Congresswoman Slaughter. And in fact, we didn't see eye to eye on many things while she was in office during her tenure. One of the things that we didn't see eye to eye on was single-payer health care. I started lobbying for single-payer health care 12 years ago, long before it was cool or the topic of the day or cause célèbre. And Louise Slaughter was not receptive to the idea of signing on to expanded and improved Medicare for all. I think that through my efforts, she did come around, and by the time of her death, she did sign on to HR 676. And I think one of the distinguishing factors between myself and Louise Slaughter is that I do tend to lean forward on these issues.
Thank you. Mr. McFadden, the question for you is this. Do you think that the New York State SAFE Act should be a model for national gun control legislation?
I don't think it goes far enough. And the reason why I say that is when you look at what's going around our country in terms of schools right now, our schools still are not protected by the SAFE Act. Most schools do not have measures put in place to protect children while they're at school. Our urban schools, amazingly enough, have those measures in place. You have metal detectors at the door. You have resource officers in the school. So I would say the SAFE Act, as good as it is, it does not go far enough because the SAFE Act cannot protect rural communities or suburban communities from school violence in terms of guns. And we have to figure out how we protect kids in school, how we protect our most vulnerable population of people, which are our young people. I think we still have some things to do, but I do think it's a great law.
Mr. Morelli?
Yes, many people may not remember this. My first campaign for the State Assembly, I ran on a promise that we would eliminate the use of semi-automatic assault weapons in New York State, which we were able to do the next year after my election. My first day as Majority Leader, we passed the SAFE Act. I think the SAFE Act is a model for the rest of the nation. I think it is critically important, especially as we see more and more acts of violence on school grounds and in other places. And it is critically important that we have background checks, that we register weapons, that we make sure we eliminate bump stocks. And one thing that we did just this week is to pass a bill which would allow any school personnel, if they feel a student is a potential harm to others or themselves, to report them to law enforcement, remove guns from the household, and that is something that I would also do at the federal level.
Thank you. Ms. Wilt?
I also think that the SAFE Act is a good model for sensible gun legislation. And I have to say that when I visited my son at West Point, one of the things that they did was show us all of the weaponry that they would be using during cadet basic training. One of those pieces of weapons was a M4. And later on, I had an opportunity to look at some items that were seized by the Brighton Police Department. I recognized the AR-15 as being essentially the M4. The M4 is a weapon of war. Weapons of war do not belong on our streets. I also think that the SAFE Act doesn't go far enough in that we need to have increased capacity to screen for mental health and also preserve those situations where people are in instances of, domestic violence. So.
Of course. Thank you, Ms. Wilt. Ms. Barnhart?
Well, let's remember that the SAFE Act was an example of knee-jerk legislation. No one bothered to talk to gun owners about the practical enforcement. You'll remember the 7-round limit, and everyone said, what was that all about? That said, New York State has been a leader on gun control, and that is reflected in our suicide, homicide, and accident statistics, and I'm proud to be a resident of this state. I have personal experience with gun violence. I went to John Marshall High School. I've lost classmates to gun violence. For 20 years, I covered gun violence. I've sat in the living rooms of grieving families. I've interviewed paralyzed children. I've sat through countless trials and seen graphic testimony and pictures of what guns do. We have to ban the future sales of assault weapons, high-capacity magazines. We need universal background checks. We have to repeal the Dickey Amendment, which forbids research into the causes and how to prevent gun violence. And finally, Rochester is unique among upstate cities in that many of its crime guns start off as legal guns in this community, meaning they're stolen from homes and cars. And I think we have to have a serious discussion about safe storage.
Ms. Barnhart, thank you. This next question is for Mr. Morelli. I'd like to address an issue that's been in the news. In 2001, Elizabeth Crothers accused a top Democratic staffer of rape. You said at the time you didn't believe her. Even after that staffer pled guilty to sexual misconduct in a separate case, you didn't say anything. It wasn't until her accusations resurfaced last month that you apologized. You've explained the delay by saying that you didn't realize the pain your words had caused. Do you think you should have apologized sooner, regardless of the impact?
Well, first of all, I think over a long career that I've had, I've been tremendously supportive of efforts to improve women's health, improve the climate of sexual harassment and sexual assault. I made a mistake and I've apologized for it. I deeply regret it. I didn't apologize early because I've never met Ms. Crothers, and only just a few weeks ago was the first time I really heard her speak out or mention the comments I made 17 years ago. So I made my apology public because I do regret what I said, and wrote her a note to apologize personally. I think that all of us have learned, and I'm grateful for the work that has been done over the last several years. I'm very proud of the work that we've done in the State Assembly in terms of reforming our sexual harassment and assault policy. We've worked very hard to make sure that there are no more secret non-disclosure agreements filed unless at the request of the victim. We have worked very hard to make sure that there is training for every single member, mandatory, as well as staff. We've now made that part of state law. We've included a requirement that anyone doing business with the state as a contractor has to have those policies put in place as well. So I think we've done a great deal. I want to go to Washington and continue the fight to make sure that every single person feels safe in the workplace as well as feeling safe at home.
Thank you. Ms. Wilt, of course, you can address this particular issue, or you can talk about the Me Too movement in general, whatever you'd like to do.
Well, I think this is a moment when more underrepresented voices are being heard and recognized than ever before. And I think that's a positive development. I think that it takes representation in order for people to be represented. If you don't have people who look like you in office, then many of your concerns aren't met in office. And I think that anybody who aspires to this office should aspire to represent all people in the 25th Congressional District. I think that Mr. Morelli has a failing there, a fundamental failing.
Ms. Barnhart.
I was proud to stand next to Ms. Crothers when she came to Rochester to talk about this incident and inform voters that she doesn't think Joe should go to Congress. This wasn't an isolated incident. I'm glad that Joe apologized. It was appropriate. But he didn't mention what happened in 2013. He was one of the first people standing next to Sheldon Silver when Sheldon Silver defended secret sexual harassment settlements that were awarded to Assemblyman Vito Lopez's staffers. Sheldon almost lost his job over that. But there was Joe standing right next to him. Joe was always standing next to Sheldon Silver through multiple scandals, and it wasn't until the day he was indicted that Joe finally said enough. In 2010, the Democratic Chronicle wrote that Joe's support of Sheldon Silver hurt this area and that he was playing too much inside politics and was too concerned with pulling the levers instead of standing up and doing what's right. How can we expect him to go to Washington and fight Donald Trump? And furthermore, he used the apology to Ms. Crothers to tout legislation that victims of harassment in the legislature, and there are more than a few, said was inadequate because it didn't have whistleblower protections and they would not be able to find out the outcome of investigations. We have work to do to listen to women.
Mr. McFadden.
Well, I'm going to say this. I'm a strong father. I have 3 daughters. I was raised by a single mother. I believe that we must, whether we're male or female, protect people's rights, must not violate them, and when they file a complaint, we should listen to that complaint with real honesty. And what I mean by that, some of us listen to respond, but some of us don't listen to actually understand. And as a father of 3 daughters, this issue is personal to me because I could imagine how I would feel as a father if my daughters were violated and they went to tell someone and that was not respected, heard, or acted on. That would anger me. And this community should know that if I go to Washington, that I believe in equal pay for females. I believe in equal rights for everybody, no matter what they look like, what their sexual orientation is, or what sex they might be, because this world operates better when we're all on an even playing field.
Mr. Morelli, would you like to respond?
Well, as I've said before, I'm imperfect. I made a mistake a long time ago. I've learned from it. As to suggestions that I stood by when other people were abused, there's no truth to that whatsoever. The secret agreements that were made, I find reprehensible, and that's why we put an end to them. As part of leadership in the last several years, we've completely reformed the way that we do business in the Assembly, and we were prepared to, in the case of Mr. Lopez, prepared to remove him from the legislature the day that he resigned.
Mr. Morelli, thank you. Ms. Wilt, this question is for you, and it's from the League of Women Voters. The Affordable Care Act is not perfect and requires revisions, but it did increase health insurance coverage across the United States. Since the 2016 election, it has been weakened. What would you do to improve health insurance in our country and contain health costs at the same time? You mentioned single payer. There's a difference between universal and single payer. Which do you back?
I back single payer, expanded and improved Medicare for all, a la HR 676. And I back that because what it does is it removes the middleman from our insurance structure. Right now, Medicare runs at an administrative overhead rate of about 2%. Private health insurers run at administrative rates in excess of 15%. By removing those administrative costs, we will realize savings and be able to cover more people, and also direct more of our healthcare dollars towards actual care. So I am a strong proponent of HR 676. I was prior to probably the rest of the people on this stage, and I think that is the direction we should be headed.
Ms. Barnhart.
One of the problems with our country's healthcare system is costs. Our costs for administrative, equipment, drugs, salaries are much higher than other countries. That's why I am a proponent of single-payer healthcare, the Medicare for All government-run equitable insurance program. There are other Democratic proposals out there. One or two would involve being able to buy into the Medicare program as individuals or as businesses. Another would allow government to run programs operated by private insurers, but government would negotiate the prices. We need to have, as Americans, a robust debate about what exactly we want from our healthcare system and what can we achieve together in a bipartisan way. I hope it's single payer, but we need to leave the door open to these other possibilities. But the end result should be the same, and that is that everyone has health care, affordable and accessible health care, because health care is a human right.
Mr. McFadden.
The reason why we have a crisis in our healthcare industry is because of for-profit companies running up the rates. If you look at what's going on in other countries that have universal health care, all 31 of them pay less than we do, and they have more protections than we do right now currently. I support favoring a universal healthcare system that's similar to Japan or the Netherlands. Why? Because they have the highest length of life, meaning their life expectancy is higher than anyone else's, and it's basically linked to their access to healthcare. So for me, this is about getting out the for-profit businesses in healthcare and looking at best practices around the country. There are 31 nations that have universal healthcare. They all pay less than we do, but have more protection and more coverage than we do. There's no reason why we can't do it. And let's be honest, it's the lobbyists that are driving up the prices, and that's the reason why we don't have it now.
Mr. Morelli.
Yeah, I do think health care is a fundamental right, and we have to make sure that everyone in America has access to affordable, accessible health care, quality health care. And when I was the chair of the Insurance Committee, I was the person responsible for helping implement the Affordable Care Act, building up the exchange in New York, expanding Medicaid for people. I would use the Medicare system, and I would do a number of things. First of all, I would expand Medicare so that we eventually, over a period of time, have everybody in the United States under the Medicare system. Now, that could be quicker, or it'd take more time depending on what people's interest in joining. If you have a business provider or employer provided system, you may not wish to port to Medicare immediately. It has to be paid through a progressive tax so that there are enough resources in it to make sure that everyone is covered, and everyone is covered through an expanded Medicare system. Medicare today is not a single-payer system. Medicare, if you have Part A or B, may be provided directly by Medicare, but not all Medicare Part B is. Part C and D are paid for by for-profit and not-for-profit insurers. So we have to reform the Medicare system entirely, and we need to expand it so it has vision, hearing. We have to eliminate racial disparities so that where you live is not in any way reflective of what type of health care you get. So I would work on those things if I'm elected to Congress.
Thank you, Ms. Barnhart. Congresswoman Slaughter began as a local activist, then moved to the county legislature, then eventually the state assembly before she joined Congress. Where do you think you've picked up the experience necessary to be successful in Congress?
Thank you for this question. Right now, there are people all over the country, especially women, running for Congress who have never held elected office before. They're doing that because that is what our founding fathers intended. If we only require one experience to go to Congress, we're going to have a Congress that looks exactly the same way it does for many years to come. I have the perfect experience to go to Congress. I've spent the last 20 years fighting for facts, truth, accountability, and transparency. Those things are under attack right now in Washington. I've also built trust with the community, and I've built relationships. I even had relationships with people who didn't really like what I was reporting, but they respected me and they knew that I was fair. These are skills we need in politics and skills we need in government. What we don't need is the same old, same old. We don't need to send Albany to Washington. We don't need to send someone to Washington who did nothing in the wake of corruption and sexual harassment scandals. This election is the perfect opportunity to turn the page and elect new people and chart a new path for the Democratic Party, which has to offer hope and opportunity and not just fealty to donors and lobbyists and corporations.
Mr. McFadden?
Well, I'll start with this. I was born into extreme poverty. And if you ask anyone what my trajectory would have been at that time, it probably would have been in jail or in the graveyard. But I was put on probation at the age of 15 and got a college scholarship at 18. Was able to get a degree in accounting. I came back here as a financial analyst for fleet investment operations, then became a controller of a software development company. And from there, I became a city council member. I was president of my neighborhood association, and I've written more legislation on the city council than any of my current colleagues, and I'm the most senior member of the city council. I also have experience in Washington. When I sat as the president of the National Black Caucus of local elected officials, I actually had an office on Pennsylvania Avenue because of the work that I did in D.C., working with Congress members to write policies to protect voting rights, to protect health care for people in states that didn't have the protections we have in New York State.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli?
You know, I think more and more Americans realize that the lack of experience at any governmental level by Donald Trump has turned out to be a disastrous experiment. I think he is uniquely incapable. He may be the worst president in American history. It's hard to figure out who would be worse. And I think that shows people that experience in government, the ability to build coalitions, the ability, when necessary, to work across the aisle, the ability to listen, to hear, to examine, to question, is important. I've been very proud of my service in the county legislature and in the state legislature. As the majority leader of the state assembly, we've enacted in the most progressive legislative body in the country the highest minimum wage, paid family leave, marriage equality, women's reproductive rights, the SAFE Act, the DREAM Act, the list goes on and on. I'm very, very proud to have played a significant role in all of those measures because I think they're moving people in New York forward. I'd like to take that same experience to Washington to help repair this country.
Thank you. Ms. Wilk?
Well, much like our former Congresswoman Louise Slaughter, I have spent the last decade and a half organizing on the ground, fighting for social, economic, and environmental justice. I've been involved in building coalitions and forming these partnerships over the past decade. And now as an elected official, we have had the most productive year of resolutions in Brighton Town Board than we have seen in many, many years. We're the only town in Monroe County to have passed the community choice aggregation law. We are the only town to have, we are one of 3 towns in the state to have passed legislation with regard to rent discrimination. We've also passed legislation with regard to climate change. These are all initiatives that I undertook on the town board level, and I think my experience in listening to people and implementing the policies that they most want is what's valuable.
Ms. Wilt, thank you. We are going to take a very quick break. When we return, we'll pick up right where we left off with the 25th Congressional District Democratic primary debate.